frankly, I don't even know where to begin from. And I was in some ways very happy to see the topic of this session, women constructed and women reconstructed. In some ways, it allows one to speak of women and choose different kinds of contexts in which to speak about women. On the other hand, there may be a danger that in the context that I'm thinking to be relevant to this discussion may not necessarily be the context in which you are looking at. But this is what I want to talk about. I think it's useful in some ways, not only in the context of the women's movement in Pakistan, but all women's activities for human rights in the South Asian context. Because I think that like a child grows and various kinds of consciousness seeps into their minds, and their experiences teaches them what is hot and what we should not touch, is the right way in some ways to also recognize your own social and political environment and to be able to respond to your environment in a manner which caters for the development of not just the women's consciousness in this country, but also the development of women as persons and as people. It's a fairly complex topic to unravel and history to unravel, but I think one point from where I would like to begin is, some people may challenge the statement that I'm going to make, but I think that is a reality. And many of us have been a part of that reality and perhaps will understand it when I say that many of the issues today being raised, not in the context of women's rights, but in the context of politics, in the context of social degradation and social changes, not only in Pakistan but in our surrounding areas. These discussions and these discourses were really triggered off by the women's movement, especially in our country. And I always say that, or at least they were revisited through the women's movement, and given a newer life and newer dimensions. The other statement that I wish to make also is that I think it is political movements that in some ways in recent times have given more significance to women's movements. And I will take the example of Pakistan and Philippines to illustrate that. And third statement that I would like to make is that the women's human rights movement is perhaps at a stage where it has now achieved what it has been trying to achieve since the past 1.5 decades, and that is to come out of an isolation in some ways. When I say it is beginning to achieve, I want to emphasize that it has not yet achieved it. Just to clarify the point further, my experience tells me that in the early 80s, the strategy of women in development, which focused on women, was in one way very successful because it did create different kinds of consciousness in women. It did develop it did give women a lot of maturity in their thinking, but on the other hand, failed totally to create a parallel level of consciousness in the society. This is our situation here. And the result is that we are left with at least one more conflict and one more source of tension with which we have to deal in the midst of so many other conflicts and tensions that we are facing in our societies. Be it religious tensions, be it political or ethnic tensions. I think the gender tension is also there and is developing very much so. It is of course linked with the other tensions, but at the same time it has its peculiar and specific fallout as well with which we have had to deal. I would like to speak about the early years of the women's movement in Pakistan to be able to substantiate the statements that I just made. Let me take the time of the early 80s. I'm not saying that there had never been a women's movement in Pakistan. There had been. But it was never a consolidated movement as such. We always had a struggle. And women had been struggling in different ways to achieve certain ends and certain objectives. And they had struggled just as hard as we think that women after the 80s decade struggled. But it was a different environment in which they were struggling. It were different forces which they were confronted with and which they had to deal with, and therefore their strategies and their manner of dealing with those forces were slightly different. If you look at the 80s, this was the time at which women had socially not gained very much even in the previous decades, but there had been an expectation that something good is going to come about, especially where the state intervened and took some steps. Those interventions, at least at the level of rhetoric, were not against women's rights, or were not contrary to the women's aspirations women's aspirations for non-segregation and women's aspirations for mainstreaming themselves in different fields. Suddenly in the 80s, we saw a time when the institutional response and the instruments of the state were trying to develop a value system which was totally in contrast to what the aspirations of the developing woman were. And it was then that this movement really, or this struggle took on the shape of a movement as a resistance to that value system. I don't think that we people who were involved in it were at that time as conscious as perhaps we are today of our own environment and what our own weaknesses and what our own immaturities at that time were. But I think the good thing is that we learned the hard way. And because we learned the hard way, the capacity to stick to a direction which we finally chose was enhanced in many ways. For instance, as soon as the Islamization process in Pakistan began, our knee-jerk reaction was talk to these Islamists and try and get them on your side. Question the policies being proposed or being imposed in the context of religion, and try and make religion a more benign phenomenon in order to be able to carry out the discourse and not be clamped down from the very beginning. We tried it. And when I go to places like Indonesia where there is this beginning, I see the 80s happening all over again. And it becomes very difficult to convince them that we've been through it, because I think everyone feels that their experience at least is the first one and there's no harm in it. I think they also need to first touch the hot coals and then realize that they're not supposed to be touched. But I think this was very important growing up process for us. There was this knee-jerk reaction, and on the other hand, we were lucky, I think, we also had the good fortune of having people amidst us who, through their own experiences, were able to guide us. So this was not a movement that was totally unguided. And I see people here whose thinking influenced the women's movement at that time, and our own experiences coupled with that guidance showed us very clearly where the spaces were which would open up and make for us an avenue to go forward. Earlier years were when we had all these mullahs, including Mr. Khairul Qadri, coming in to WAF functions and telling us what women's rights under Islam are. And then, of course, many of us realized that even what this man is saying, or this woman is saying, who is supposed to be a more liberal interpreter of Islam, it's not really fitting the framework that we have prescribed for ourselves. And that framework was of rights, of social justice and equality under the international or what the universally accepted standards that we at that time realized were there. This brought us one step further. It was not an easy process, and let me tell you, it was a very painful process at times for the women's movement. It never happened smoothly. It didn't happen without dissensions amongst ourselves. It didn't happen without causing pain to ourselves and to those who were very near to us and who were people who were, in some ways very closely associated in this movement. But it did happen eventually. And the women's movement gave out a very clear message. And that message was, look, we are here. And we are here to stay. And this is what we think. And what we thought, in fact, and what we expressed as what we thought were the larger national issues at that time. And I think that was the most significant aspect of the women's movement. There were some very important things happening, of course, within the women's movement. The call for reform in family laws, the call for reform in other laws which were discriminatory. But at the same time, when we saw this and analyzed what we wanted, we realized that these were actually larger national issues. And having identified that reality, we were then able to push ourselves forward and make ourselves visible as a national movement. We are not apologetic for the women's movement. There is total legitimacy of the women's movement. And this legitimacy was made even more clear because of the context in which we were fighting for our rights. And there was a time, I know, in Pakistan, and we are very proud of it. We are extremely proud of it, of the contributions that we made for the democratic struggle in this country. Not as individuals. As individuals, many of us have been involved for much longer than even the women's movement appeared in the present shape in this country. But at the same time, as a movement, we did make this contribution. And then the other flip side of it was that once we were a part of the democratic struggle, we understood what the essence of a democratic dispensation should be, and then realized that democracy also has to be gender sensitive. And therefore, strengthened our stake in democracy. And did not think that our role merely was to fight for women's rights, gain constitutional equality, which meant very little for us in any case. We've had this since 1973, very clearly spelled out in our constitution. But what does our constitution mean anyway? If it is to be violated by the judiciary itself in the name of social norms and not giving women unconditional access to their constitutional rights and freedoms by saying if this woman doesn't conform to it, we don't care, we don't think she's entitled to her fundamental rights. Or whether it is to be violated, the constitution, by the military. It has become a piece of paper. And I think it is very important for us, maybe there's no time today, but to sit down and examine the process which culminates in this situation, where all those things which you thought were important and would be effective guarantees really mean very little in the face of forces which exist and have existed for a long time. The trouble, I think, starts when we start struggling in our isolated spheres and forget that our problems really arise from 1, 2, or 3 very distinct, very identifiable forces, which are creating not only a political mess, but they are creating a social mess as well in this country. And I'm not talking just about Pakistan. I think the women's movement has very deep relevance to the militarization of the polity in any country. I think the earlier speaker had identified some of the strings which are very clear, the connection between control, the culture of authority. It perpetuates itself. Any organization that sustains itself and promotes itself and is able to gain its objectives through the promotion of a culture of authority will never change its nature, whatever the political environment may be. It may change its terminology, it may change its strategies, but no organization wishes to destroy itself or to weaken itself. I think it is very easily understandable. And therefore that culture or the core of that culture will never be destroyed. And then what they do is they find partners. And they will find partners who will help them to perpetuate and spread that culture of authority and control. Thus, the very visible and traditional alliance between the mullah and the military. At the social level, where these two entities do not necessarily seep down, they find other partners for the perpetuation of the culture of authority, and that they find in the social structures. Somewhere it is the feudal structures, in other situations it's the tribal or the Sardari structure, and this then makes itself visible in what comes to the surface. The control, political control, is by the same forces. Social control is by the same forces. Economic control is by the same forces. If that control is vested in the very same forces which are creating the problem of rights, then you can imagine how difficult the struggle for rights becomes. We talk about a time where spaces are being created, and we say these are windows of opportunity, and there has been no dearth of these so-called windows of opportunities in our lives. Those windows have been opened, or at least they have been opened, and we see that behind those windows is not a garden, but a scenery of a garden. And the capacity of movements to recognize the sham from the reality is very important. Whether this is a window or whether it is a space that is being created, I think this is actually the pit of wisdom, which I don't think that is attained to the ideal level anywhere. But I think some level of understanding should be created, because one of the tools or one of these strategies, let me say, that is employed time and again. Let me just go back a little bit. And when I talk about the window of opportunity, this window of opportunity, or the sham that is committed on the people in the name of window of opportunity, is not done unthinkingly. There is a reason behind it. And that is a very good strategy, which is from time to time, let the steam out. Because if you don't let the steam out, then there is going to be much bigger trouble. So they let the steam out from time to time. But in this process of letting the steam out, which is a very calculated move at times, what happens to the civil society? When I talk about militarization, I also talk about it in terms of a conflict of interest, a vested interest which is in conflict with the interest of the civil society. And the fractured civil society is never able, in fact, to gain the kind of strength that it probably needs to be able to negotiate with those forces at a level of parity, and they will not. How does the civil society not? How is the civil society not allowed that space? Is especially during these periods of letting out steam, because that those who understand that the windows as being windows of opportunities, very understandably, and I'm not blaming anyone for it, I think it is very understandable because of frustration built up over the years, you try and clutch at straws. So in the process of clutching at straws, civil society gets divided and movements get divided. And this further weakens the base or the structure from which we can get up and develop, and then find the strength to negotiate our rights within that, that conflict that has been created of rights. It is in some ways very simple to understand that where there is a visible conflict of rights, and if we are able to identify it and understand it, then there should be no expectation that the more powerful will concede their rights in favor of the marginalized, because they have suddenly become very benign and very magnanimous. It doesn't happen because the process of the characteristic of magnanimity is not seen in those who have exercised power and wish to exercise power. What happens is that from time to time, because of their own compulsions and the compulsions that times impose on them, and not necessarily the domestic situation, because that they are able to control much better than the international situation. So the compulsions are coming from somewhere else, but because of those compulsions, they have to give a different wrapping to the same old formulas. And those come into being. The result is that no change really happens, and at the end of it, there is what we saw as a light at the end of the tunnel suddenly disappears, and we are again at a stage where the frustration is even more deepened. I think women have gone through that, and it is now that I think they are experiencing those frustrations from which they remained aloof at other times. Now that because of their more involvement more with the patterns which are affecting them every day just as much as it is affecting the next person, they are feeling that frustration as well. And they are able to see that nothing really will come out of it unless a substantial change is heralded by measures which will guarantee that that change will take place. Another thing which I think we need to notice in these few years is not just the coming out of our isolation in the national context, but coming out of our isolation because of the need to find solace, strength and support outside our national context and go into the regional context. And I think the 80s and the 90s saw a lot of regional initiatives springing, and especially the women's movement took many of such initiatives. Hamida and I have been part of many of those. What was the essence of that, and what I think did we gain from that? I personally, what I gained was that while a lot of consciousness was happening here, we were becoming more and more mature in our thinking, developing our strategies with much more maturity. Suddenly this exposure to the other points of view also made us conscious of things which were, or events which were very relevant to our lives, but we never paid attention to it. I think it was in the 80s that for the first time what happened to women in East Pakistan late 80s, started being discussed by women in this country. And at that time it was taboo to even speak of the Bangladesh War of Independence. And if I called it the War of Independence at that time, I would probably be hanging from some tree before I even hanged from the gallows. because I would have probably been lynched. But now, the very interesting thing is that women had started speaking of that event, historical event, as the Bangladesh War of Independence. It was here still the movement for secession. But we did start to speak about it in that context. We did start to make our partners with, or link our thinking with women outside Pakistan rather than men or the society in general in Pakistan. And I think now we see the fruits of that initiative, of at least starting the discussion at that time. Today, many people who at that time would not even speak about it, and I think Auntie Tara is sitting here and she is perhaps the sole witness of what happened to her in 1971 when she went out in the street and everybody told her, don't do it, this is an unpopular issue. But because she couldn't reconcile it with her conscience, and three or four of her friends went out and spoke about the military action or protested against the military action, people came and spat on their face. And these are the very people today who are shouting for the lives of the generals who have been exposed in the Rahman Commission report. What was said in the Rahman Commission has not been revealed today. It was there. Everybody knew what was happening. But there was either silence or a very, very strong voice trying to tell us how good it is that we've gotten rid of the Bengalis and how much Pakistan will prosper. Well, 30 years hence, we've seen how much we've prospered. And we haven't prospered, not necessarily because East Pakistan is not now a part of Pakistan. We haven't prospered because we didn't pay attention to what the East Pakistanis were saying at that time. We didn't pay attention to the very strong reality and very open reality in this country that we are not a homogeneous society. You cannot impose homogeneity and deny plurality and diversity and try and create an artificial bond without creating real common interests, and which will in turn create the urge to remain together. A consistent pattern of injustices not only creates a real sense of deprivation, but also gives rise to perceptions of deprivations. You don't want to deal with those perceptions, and you cannot deal with it with those perceptions in the kind of political the environment that we were going through. These are political issues, have to be dealt with in a political manner. They cannot be dealt with by the army. People here say that the composition of the army is a big factor in this. It's a largely Punjabi-dominated military, and therefore, whenever they come into power, there is an automatic perception of deprivation of power by the other ethnic groups or other provinces. I say, let's say that the composition was even more fair. What is the training of the military? Can we expect that very complex political issues, these are not simple issues, these are not simple matters, will be dealt with them? Will they confront it? Or will they let that festering of bitterness grow and then come to a point where people, like the Bengali said, thank you very much, we are ready to leave. But we never learned a lesson. We kept saying, "Hum sab Musliman hain, we are brothers in Islam." For God's sakes, you will not lose your Islamic identity if you accept the fact and the reality that you are not just Muslims, you are people occupying certain territory because by virtue of having a particular culture or an identity, which was Islamic much later than it was something else, and we have much more binding and much more relevance to those identities than we would have perhaps to Islam. But in the enthusiasm to create that Islamic culture, ethnicity is denied, culture is denied, diversity is denied, and we come to this stage where today we again have a Pakistan, which is, if you're in Islamabad and then travel to Balochistan and Sindh, you'll be thoroughly confused. What is happening? In some places, you're hearing the reality of their lives. Today I was at the Human Rights Commission annual general meeting where core groups and correspondents from all over the country were there. And I think anybody sitting there if they had heard what those people were saying, you would not, if you were a Pakistani, you would not sleep tonight. And I probably will not. And it's not just that I have not heard those. Why will I not sleep is that these are the realities and nobody wants to pay attention to them. What is our priority today? Kashmir and Afghanistan. For the sake of Afghanistan, and in order to promote the national security interests of the US and the West, we sacrificed Pakistan to an extent where today we are a totally different people in some ways than we were before 1979. We are a totally different people. We are a totally different state as well. Regardless of whether we have the same constitution, the fact remains that the state today has gained its own identity, its own priorities, which are not in consonance with the needs of the people of Pakistan, and therefore the people of Pakistan today do not make the state of Pakistan. And if Pakistan at any time wants to assert its sovereignty and say that these are not national issues, these issues we are confronting in our country, there is no legitimacy of the international community to interfere, they are totally wrong. For one thing, where there are human rights violations, it is a legitimate concern of the international community. Secondly, what right to sovereignty does this state have? Sovereignty is claimed in the name of the people. But when the interests of the state become directly in conflict with the interest of the people of the country, there is no concept of sovereignty in that country. It is not in my interest. It never was to have a large defense budget in this country. It is not in my interest to pursue the foreign policy that this government, or even our civil governments, may be controlled by the military, but not having the courage to look at the welfare of the people. The state has pursued policies which are contrary to my interest. They are contrary to my social economic interests, they are contrary to my political interests, they are contrary to my social interests. Because for as long as Pakistan continues in its jihadi, persistence of jihadi sentiments, the majority of the people in Pakistan, and I'm not here talking about just women or the minority, non-Muslim citizens of this country, I'm talking about the people of Pakistan. Because the jihadi concept does not just have social implications for women and non-Muslims, it has very important economic implications for the common man in Pakistan. This jihadi sentiment has led us to a situation now where, and I can tell you, despite what this military government is saying, today nobody is paying attention to domestic issues. Why? Because it is not of interest to them. It is not their priority. This military government did not come here to solve the problem of poverty. They did not come here to solve the problem of social and economic injustices and inequality. They have come here because of the aftermath of Kargil.
Yes. Yeah.
And that is their agenda. And while they are pursuing their agenda, they are stepping on the toes of the people of Pakistan, and they are injuring and hurting the social and economic interests of this nation. especially the social and economic and political interests of women and non-Muslim citizens. Take the example of the Hudud Ordinance. 25 years we've been shouting ourselves hoarse. We've had gains in that. I'm not even going to undermine the significance of the change that the women's movement has been able to bring about. But we brought it about despite the state rather than because of it. If judicial attitudes have changed in recent years towards women, or slightly changed, marginally changed towards women, it is not because the state or any government, be it Benazir or Nawaz Sharif or Mr. Parvez Musharraf, were able to bring that change about. It was through our struggle that this change was brought about. This was the power of persuasion. And not just the women's movement, let us say the human rights movement and the other social movements that are going on in this country at the same time. That change has come, it is too little and perhaps too late. Because while that very little change has come, the opposing forces have become even stronger. And today, what is at stake will be measured from their needs and not from ours. So policy will be made according to what is their need, what is the need of the jihadis in Kashmir, what is the need of the Taliban in Afghanistan, then because of what our need is. This government held a large human rights conference in April last year. And one of the issues that, and many of the issues were issues of the social movements and women's rights and human rights movements that they brought up, and they said, we are going to take some steps on this. It was not done because this government wanted to assure us that we are wearing a uniform but we've got a good heart. They don't care. They don't need to assure me because they know from past 4 experiences that I haven't been able to hurt a hair on their head. Because every time that they have come, our judiciary has not only created acceptability for them, they have given them legitimacy and they have given them more than they ever wanted. They have been more loyal than the king. So they know very well. मुझसे कोई खतरा नहीं है उनको. But उनको खतरा किससे है? उनको चाहिए इंटरनेशनल पब्लिक ओपिनियन अपने फेवर में. वो मास्टर्स, वो पेट्रन्स जिनके इंटरेस्ट को ये प्रमोट करते रहे हैं थ्रू आउट आवर हिस्ट्री, उनकी पेट्रनेज को करने के लिए और उनके लिए आसान बनाने के लिए कि वो लेजिटिमेटली कह सकें कि दिस इज अ वेरी बिनाइन मिलिट्री गवर्नमेंट. सो डोंट से एनीथिंग टू दैट. But what happens to us in that process? We get divided. We have this big convention in which some of us feel that yes, that space might be opened, and why not try and make a strike while it's possible. And then the movement gets broken, and very important actions that we should have been taking, we could not take because we were not consolidated enough. We get consolidated at the end when everything, all the mischief has been done. By the time we are able to consolidate ourselves through our thinking and then be able to find the resources, both energy and other resources we want to, we are at a stage where the damage has been so grave that it's very difficult to undo it immediately, and then we look for undoing it in the next 10 years. So we are 20 years behind already. We haven't been able to undo what Mr. Ziaul Haq did. Now what this chap does adds another 10 years. This is our tragedy. I'm not trying to create a feeling of pessimism. I'm never a pessimist. I think for as long as we are able to get the energy to fight them, I don't care. I can fight my own life, and I think everybody here has no problems with fighting. The question is, will one lifetime be enough? And the question also is not to be duped. I don't mind losing, but I would hate to be thought or hate to be duped. This is the situation now. NGOs, when I speak about consolidating ourselves, Pakistan has a very, very now living NGO community in some ways. very good work has been done, and I think I'm not giving ourselves any credit, but I'm saying that this is an important movement. It should have happened in this country, and some of the very important work that needed to be done was done because of these NGOs. And why? Because the political forces, in some ways, compromised on very significant transfer of power issues. They compromise so much on their own power to the military when democracy is restored that they are not able to take any stands. Then the military starts this campaign of discrediting political forces. And what happens is, ultimately, their credibility is such a low ebb that they then become dependent on the mullahs in some ways for their own significance. Next thing is that when this credibility crisis happens, the vacuum that is created is taken up by the mullahs. Some political parties try that, okay, there are some discredited forces, let us try and penetrate this vacuum and not allow the mullahs to come. But they are too weak. It is too initial a period for them to be able to take up that vacuum, and the result is that new people don't emerge. Secondly, I think the political process itself, let us leave the political parties alone. Political process is the essential thing. The political process has to go on. Where in the world is there an ideal democracy? Where in the world is there an ideal democratic culture? You learn the value of democratic culture once you have experienced it. We have not experienced it to a level where we have learned to value it yet. Nevertheless, what little we have been able to gain today and what they have not been able to destroy yet totally is not because of the the magnanimity of the military government. It is because they cannot destroy it. We have learned the value of freedom of the press. हमें आदतें कुछ बढ़ गई हैं 12 सालों में, जिन आदतों के लिए हम लड़ने को अभी तैयार हैं और ये उनको समझ में आती है. ये उनकी कोई कंसेशन नहीं है. ये एक some of these lingering strains of democratic rights that we see and experience in Pakistan today are not because this is a benign military government or because that it is so magnanimous that it is decided to concede to the people their right. No. It is because we have gotten used to it, and in some ways that has created a sense of vulnerability amongst the military in trying to destroy it. They know that this will not be a wise thing to do. It will only complicate problems for them. They may be able to deal with it because the way that they know how to deal with it is force, and they will do it. 23rd March was a very telling day in Pakistan. What did you see? The big military parade. The expression of democratic rights through the getting together of the political forces in this country was totally clamped down. So the military made the message very clear to us. Voices expressing or asserting democratic rights are not significant for this 23rd of March, but the military parade in Islamabad is. And that is what we saw in Pakistan. We saw the military, we saw it in action. And we also saw the agencies of the state in action in Lahore. And I think that tells the story of Pakistan as it is today. If this was a benign government, if it was so magnanimous and was willing to concede to the people of Pakistan their right, they would not have destroyed all the institutions like the judiciary in this country, the parliament in this country, discrediting the political forces and thereby injuring democracy itself and not Benazir or Nawaz Sharif. I think I'll stop here. I may not have said many things which are relevant, but
Thank you very much, Hina. You, I think, have come up to expectation. One expects you to give this rather finale at this stage. Because we started off this morning talking about Bangladesh 30 years ago and military action and trying to understand why there wasn't sufficient response in Pakistan or resistance in Pakistan or even recognition in Pakistan as to what the government of Pakistan was doing. 30 years later, you're trying to suggest that we are still sleeping. And I say we are sleeping not only in Pakistan but also in the rest of South Asia, because militarization is very evident in Pakistan, but I think it's also becoming a reality in countries like India and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal, what we've heard this morning. And not only militarization, but it's accompanied by this whole politics of extremism, bringing in religious forces and so on, and forces which tend to divide people and maintain small groups in power. Hina has given us a fantastic, I think, analysis of what's wrong, where Pakistan is going, and the important need for us to think about where we need to go in our own modes of resistance. I'd like to now open the discussion. I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments. Anis?
Thank you, Hina, for giving us such a clear and most vital presentation in such simple words without hiding behind the jargons. And I think that it is really fantastic that you have such clear views and perceptions and analysis when most of us are very confused about the role of the present government. But I think that what women's movement have to look into the issues very seriously. That when we talk about women's rights, are we talking about women's rights in isolation? And when we talk about women's gains, are we talking about women's gains in isolation? If all the disadvantaged groups of the society are fragmented, or they are being offered something which in our short-sightedness we look as the gains, then I think it's a great tragedy, because we are definitely getting divided at this point. Because in the world, I don't see any historical evidence that women's rights and human rights and military rights go together. It has never happened. It has not happened ever in the world that military governments have something to offer to the people. So either we are looking at the larger interest of the people, or looking at just the windows of opportunity, and I would look at it as deliberate diversions, not as the windows of opportunity or spaces being provided to us. I think it is deliberate diversion, and women's movement in Pakistan should take a serious note of it.
I think Mr. just to make one more point here, that it's not only that we get duped at times, and that has its own adverse consequences, but sometimes people who are the non-partisan forces in this society sometimes think, because of this halo of self-righteousness that we create around ourselves, that we are able to replace the political forces, especially the NGOs. I think they've done terrific work. They've done very good work. Nevertheless, they must know what their proper role is and what their own limitations might be if they try and take on a role which is not suited to their framework. Political forces are the essence of a political process. Secondly, to find spaces for political progress in totally depoliticized formulae and contexts, I think is a fool's dream, fool's paradise. So what if 1/3 women get seats in this devolution plan? But I shouldn't say so what, but it has some benefit. Nevertheless, the point is, will it be able to achieve the objective that you want to achieve? On the one hand, we are very happy that we have achieved something about the women's role in politics by getting 1/3 representation. That is not women's role in politics. Does that women's representation only means women in politics? What about the hundreds of constituencies in different parts of Pakistan where women were not allowed to vote, even in this election? Did anybody come and say that this is totally contrary to this policy of 1/3? You can't allow women not to vote and then allow that election to be valid. Pakistan Election Commission has to declare that election invalid. This happened even in the past. The Women's Action Forum, if you remember, took up this issue that women were not allowed to vote in a certain constituency. That election is invalid by consensus of the opposing candidates. So today also, I say to you that this is one evidence of, or one point that substantiates the argument that 0 plus 0 will make 0. This is one devolution formula in which today one of the non-Muslim members of the HRCP drew our attention to the fact that Muslim voters had 5 votes. They cast 5 ballots. Non-Muslim citizens cast 1. I mean, just bringing it down to a simple level.
I'm Christelle de Debon. I would like to know how you will qualify, speaking about women's rights and military rule, Muslim family law ordinance that was promulgated during Ayub Khan's period. Was it a window of opportunity then?
We still call it the first stepping stone on which further reform was supposed to be built. It was not an ideal law. And it perhaps also in some ways did not become an instrument of social change. But in terms of giving women a foothold in the judicial system in order to be able to get some relief, it did help. But what has happened to that family laws ordinance? Even that small measure of protection could not be tolerated by this system. And the Federal Shariat Court declared very significant provisions of the law to be invalid because they are un-Islamic, and this very benign military government talking about women's rights doesn't even have the guts to go and challenge it in the Supreme Court. That is also left on our shoulders because they don't want to take the wrath of the mullahs. Well, we've been taking it for the past 25 years, we're quite willing to take it. But the point is, this reflects on the government itself and their hollow rhetoric about women's rights.
If I may just add that the women's movement had been demanding actually more radical laws, but for instance, ban on polygamy. And the Rashid Commission, wasn't it, which had recommended that, and it wasn't brought about. And Ayub Khan at that point was interested in trying to neutralize the ulama, so he was also trying to win support from other groups.
I don't have a question, just a comment, Hina. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. It's quite something to listen to here in Pakistan as we listen to you elsewhere in the world. I wanted to say 2 things. One is that I was really glad to hear your unqualified, unashamed, unadulterated endorsement of the women's movement at the end of a day when speaker after speaker has been questioning whether there is a movement or not in our different countries. And it always worries me when we do that because really we look at South Asia. As you say, many of the developments that we see today would not have been there had they not been raised by women's groups and by the women's movement. So I think rather than self-flagellating and saying is there a movement or not, we ought to ask ourselves what we mean by movement and what we have actually done. So I was very glad to hear this at the end of the day. You missed out something that you promised us, and I wonder if you might like to speak of it now or perhaps later, which is you were going to make some kind of comparison with the Philippines, and then you forgot.
I think I want to join Urvashi in congratulating you. You made a really brilliant presentation. I don't have a question, but just I'm encouraged by a very, very wonderful presentation to just ask you, to probe you a little further, because really the underlying text of your presentation was democracy or the lack of it in Pakistan. And this is a question that we in India, and especially I'm very now talking of academics in India in the social sciences, we are often debating this whole question of why the great difference between India and Pakistan when it comes to democracy, given very similar backgrounds. So I was wondering whether you would like to comment a little further on what explains more concretely the fragility of democracy in Pakistan. I mean, 2 kinds of explanations that come to mind immediately. I'm sure there are many more. One is, of course, Aisha Jalal's argument, which everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with in her book on democracy and authoritarianism, and the kind of distinction that she makes between formal democracy and substantive democracy. And then sort of in the end, I think, sort of argues that, really speaking, this is a very fundamental difference, and if you take into account the difference between formal democracy and substantive democracy, substantive democracy is absent in both India and Pakistan, but formal democracy is present in both India and Pakistan. And a second type of argument that I have often heard, for example, from one of your, from a political scientist in Pakistan, Professor Mohammad Wasim at Qaid-e-Azam University, he has argued in some of his writings about the over-representation of the migrant elite in Pakistan in its foundational moments, and how that created its own distortions. Now, those are two kinds of explanations, both of which I think are partially right, but not entirely. And I was wondering whether you would like to add to that. And then again, when we're really looking at the trajectory of democracy in third world countries, and let us say in South Asia in particular, then I should think that, and especially given the Indian experience of democracy, I think there are two or three things which are really vital, in my view, to the development and consolidation of democracy. One is the nature of the national movement. Two, democracy, at least in India, I think, is certainly a product of a century of intellectual and political struggles. A century of intellectual and political struggles which really started in the the last quarter of the 19th century. And in those intellectual and political struggles, social reform movements, such as they were, with all their limitations, played a very, very important part. And secondly, I think relatedly, I would like to suggest that, apropos everything that you've been saying, that the relationship between secularism and democracy go hand in hand. And we can't really separate these two. I think the Indian experience and all the deviations that are beginning to emerge in India seem to underline the great importance of this very, very important link between secularism and democracy, which I think has been missing in Pakistan in very important ways. And the third, which is a point, an argument which has been made by many Western scholars, well, not Western, let us say, an argument that has often been made is that a large middle class, if not a large middle class, but a middle class, a large middle class is an important ingredient of democracy, and which brings me to my final point about the nature of class structure in Pakistan. And what, in the sense that you have this, you have an upper class, but not really the kind of large middle class, which again in India now exists, which of course in my view now is not so strongly committed to democracy. But these are three things which I think are, in my view, important. Play an important part in the growth and development of democracy. And I was wondering whether you might want to comment on that.
I would not respond to what you said, which are very significant things. And if I start on it, I'll take another hour and a half, and I don't think anybody has the energy to sit through that now. But 2 points, I think, which I would like to make. Number one, this whole questioning collective efforts, collective voices, as being movements or not. 2 voices make a movement. And a consistency in the struggle makes a movement. For me, if Auntie Tara and I today go into the street and are voicing the concerns which we are hearing from our own experiences and our own interactions with a larger mass of people, that is a movement. And therefore, I have no hesitation in saying and owning to the fact that there is a movement, not only over here. I think that now the movement is there in the level of South Asia, and I would even go further to say that because of the commonalities of women's grievances and women's aspirations, we are also now at a stage where there is a global women's movement. Because there is a collective voice, we understand the commonality of interest, we understand the conflict of interest at the international level, and therefore I say that this is a movement. Secondly, I subscribe fully to Aisha Jalal's point of view on formal and substantive democracy. I would go even one step further. I don't think democracy can be classified. There is no such thing as a formal democracy. Only a substantive democracy is a democracy. Thirdly, we keep talking about transitional societies, and say that a particular society is now in a transition towards democracy. It is very difficult to say at what time that transition society started. Can we say that at noon tomorrow we will now be a society in transition. No. One right step in the right direction can put us in that phase of transition. 100 steps, however much we may say they are, show that we are in transition, those steps may be taken, but we are not in transition. So we haven't even begun our step towards democracy.